Well, thank you very much, Martin, and good day to everybody. Thank you for joining us as we launch this second edition of the ILO's Monitor, which we are using to track the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the world of work. What I will try to do now is to take you through quite briefly what I think are the most salient points of the report that we're launching, and then, of course, be at your disposal to answer any questions that you may have. Well, we are all aware, I think, in the current circumstances that the pandemic is having very serious consequences for the world of work in a situation where just over 4 out of every 5 workers lives in a country where partial or total lockdowns are in operation. And what we've tried to do, and it's been quite a complex methodological process, is to quantify the effects of these measures being taken to stop the pandemic on the volume of work in the world of work. This is a slightly different process because given the variety of measures and work situations that people now find themselves in, it doesn't make much sense to simply say the increase in the unemployed is X. Rather, what we have done is to estimate the reduction in the number of hours being worked in the world. And by the way, the reduction in those hours of work comes to 6.7% for the next 3 months, the second trimester of the year. And perhaps more strikingly, that reduction translates into the loss in those 3 months of 195 million full-time job equivalents around the world. 195 million. And this calculated on the basic assumption of a working week of 48 hours. So I think it is obvious to you all, because these figures speak powerfully for themselves, that the world of work is suffering an absolutely extraordinary fall because of the effects of the pandemic and the measures necessarily being taken to deal with the pandemic. What our report tries to do is to disaggregate that headline figure of 195 million by giving it some breakdown in terms of the sectors most affected and what the regional distribution looks like. Let me turn firstly then to the sectors. We pick out, there is a more extensive sectoral analysis in the report, but we pick out those, in fact there are 4 sectors which are being most heavily affected by what is happening. Those are the sectors for food and accommodation, the retail and wholesale activities, business services and administration, and then manufacturing industry. And if you take aggregate employment in those 4 sectors, it adds up to 37.5% of global employment. So this is where the sharp end, if you like, of the impact of the pandemic is being felt right now. In regional terms, I think what is actually quite striking is that the effects, the employment effects of the pandemic are being felt in all regions without an enormous variety, but the highest figures in percentage terms are being felt in the Arab states, followed by Europe, and up until this point, the lowest income proportionately, I repeat, is in Africa. But if you translate those percentages into absolute numbers, unsurprisingly, the biggest losses are in the Asian Pacific region, the most populous region of the world. Colleagues, the question, of course, in the face of these statistics is what should we be doing? What should policymakers be thinking about? And the point we make strongly in this report, and I want to emphasize today, is that the longer term impact of what we're experiencing today depends crucially on how the international community manages to check the spread of the pandemic, how long it lasts and how far it gets. And then also it depends on the policy measures that we take to address the economic and social consequences of the pandemic. So there's really no certainty involved in those variables. It's why we refrain from offering any speculative estimates of what the employment situation might look like at the end of this year. It simply isn't reasonable or credible to try to quantify that. I repeat, it depends very much on measures taken in the intervening period. But I would perhaps remind us all, and I'll conclude with this in terms of the statistics, that the world started this year with foreseen unemployment of 190 million people. And what we're seeing now comes on top of that. So I think that should give you some context for the gravity of the situation that we're in. And let me reiterate what we think are the necessary areas of policy intervention. We clearly need, and we're seeing it around the world, although on an individualized national basis, efforts to stimulate economic activity through expansive fiscal, accommodating monetary policies. This is absolutely essential. We've seen what the G20 leaders have had to say about that. But we also need to see much more targeted interventions by governments to support enterprises, make sure that those enterprises which are viable in any normal circumstances are helped to survive this critical period of the pandemic, and that they in turn are able to support their employees, to retain their workforce, to maintain the employment relationship. And experience of past crises shows just how important that type of intervention is in the longer term, particularly in terms not only of surviving, but of emerging from the crisis. And not least, I suppose it's the first thing I should say, we need to make sure that those who are at work are adequately protected, that they are, particularly those working in the front lines, as they are being called, have the right types of protection. We need to see that alternative work forms are made available and properly organized where they are available. And we also have to make sure that social protection systems reach everybody in need. This is a pandemic, self-evidently, that will help, which will hit the most vulnerable the hardest. And in our social protection efforts, we need to focus our efforts most particularly and most urgently on those who are vulnerable in the world of work in general and to this pandemic in particular. Those are then some of the major points that arise from the report. We will be updating this report probably in about 2 weeks from now. So we'll be able to follow what is a very fast-moving situation as quickly as we think we need to. So I leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, DG. We'll move on now to the Q&A part. I see 2 of you have already raised your hands. If I can have a third one, so we'll take 3 questions at a time. And when I give you the floor, if you can please identify yourself and the outlet that you represent. Let's begin with Jamil. Over to you, Jamil.
I'm not getting anything.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, Mr. Ryder, good to see you in good form. Question on Latin America and specifically on Brazil. We have a very deep discussion in Brazil whether the economy should be saved or lives should be saved. That's a permanent debate for the last 2 weeks in Brazil. My question to you, how should that equation be solved? And in terms of time lost, What is the projection for Latin America and Brazil specifically? Thank you.
Thank you, Jamil. Let's go to Jeremy from
Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much for taking my question. Pretty much the same question as my colleague regarding the debate maybe in Switzerland. Some people are asking for the economy to get back on track in the next few days or weeks, saying that we can reopen the business and the shops. So do you think that's a good idea, or do you think it's too soon? And more generally, can you give us some good examples of state intervention so far regarding employment and the economy? Thanks.
Hi, can you hear me? I can't hear you. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, this is Jamie from Associated Press. I had a quick question about the figure that you mentioned, Mr. Ryder, 195,000 that you had projected 190,000, sorry, 190 million and 195 million now on top of that. I mean, would it be safe to estimate that this is actually more than a doubling of your earlier prediction, if I can, or do those numbers not match up? And I did note the one footnote that you mentioned about some of the government actions that may temper some of this possibility of it actually being 195 million. And then the other thing was just very similar to Jeremy's, which is just about where you see governments actually taking the proper steps.
Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen, for those three questions. Let me do my best to respond. I think all of your questions have behind them, probably the most frequently asked question, which is what is, the appropriate balance, reconciliation of the measures that we need to take to stop the pandemic, and then what needs to be done to get the world of work moving again. Have we got it right? The first thing I think I need to say, and I think it's fundamental, is that there is not a simple trade-off between more or less rigorous action in respect of the health issues around the pandemic on the one hand, and minimizing the economic and social consequences of the pandemic. If we did absolutely nothing today in economic and social terms, we didn't stop people working in the normal way, there would be a massively heavier burden to pay in terms of lost lives. So I think we need to get out of this appealing and evident but mistaken logic that there is a one-to-one trade-off, more stringent measures to stop the pandemic and more of a hit for the world of work. We have to find something, a logic which departs from that facile but mistaken notion. Nevertheless, it is quite clear, wherever we live and whatever the experience we have of this pandemic, it's hurting people in many, many ways. It's hurting businesses, it's hurting people and their livelihoods. Everybody wants to get back to work, get back to normal as quickly as possible. I cannot say when that should be and how it should take place. This is a matter, I think, for those policymakers who are following from the clinical point of view, the progress of the pandemic. But what we have to do is, given the circumstances that we find ourselves in, because of the health measures taken, we have to manage the economic and social effects in the best way possible. And that's where I think the issues the ILO is addressing have to be located. There is something quite peculiar about this situation, because it's very tempting to make comparisons with past crises, the 2008-2009 crisis. But the fact of the matter is, the magnitude of the economic and social issues we are discussing today are in effect a direct consequence of deliberate policies taken in the field of health. And so, and your questions imply this sort of paradox. It's almost as if we're inflicting this pain on ourselves as a deliberate policy option. But the fact of the matter is, as I've tried to say, we have to integrate our responses and try to address both of these elements in a way which is not simply the zero sum that might be, some might see. It's not a question of either saving lives or saving the economy. That's simply a false dilemma. And by the way, I should say that integrated approach to health, economic and social dimensions of the pandemic is precisely the approach being taken in the United Nations system under the leadership of the Secretary General, to which the ILO is doing its very best to contribute. What about the good examples? Well, there are, I have to say, a lot of good examples to be seen. Let's take initially the question of expansionary fiscal and monetary policies. I think we must recognize that many governments have done the right thing in basically understanding very quickly that the usual rules do not apply when it comes to fiscal prudence and monetary policy. They have to be put aside, and very, very substantial quantities of resources have to be applied to our economies. And we could make quite a long list of individual countries which are doing what it takes. I think the challenge is not only to inject the volumes of money required, it's also a question of getting them where they are needed. That is to say, to have them lever to maximum effect, support to enterprises, keep them going, and to help people through these extremely difficult times. And this is quite difficult policy design which is involved. If I can take advantage of the question, I think what is missing is the international coordination of these individual country efforts. So the US has put $2 trillion into its economy. European countries in different degrees have tried to do something similar. But what we don't see, despite the efforts of the G20, is international coordination of those efforts, still less, I think, a full response as yet to the evident need for solidarity and support for the developing and emerging world, which I think we all understand is about, I think, to bear a very, very serious, or to take the very serious brunt of the effects of the pandemic. Then going on to other measures, I think we have seen through the introduction of partial unemployment, technical unemployment, short working time measures, I think we have seen in a number of countries very appropriate reactions which enable companies to benefit from public support, but at the same time take their responsibilities in retaining their employees and keeping them connected to the company involved and to the labor market. These are the right things to do. And they work best when they are the subject of consultation and agreement between employers and employers' organizations on one side and trade unions on the other, with the benefit of public funding, as I have said. And we've seen that happening. We've seen it happening in many European countries, including my own, where it's not been the habitual way of doing things in recent years. So there are those good examples out there, but I think we're going to be tested ever more strongly, particularly as the pandemic extends its reach into the developing world.
Thank you very much, DG. Let's move on to the next round of questions. Let me go first to Gabriela Sotomayor. Gabriela, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Very nice to see you, Mr. Ryder, and everybody. My question is on Mexico. And the pandemic is not hitting very hard right now in Mexico. I mean, in terms of health cases and everything, but already there is confinement and closure of a lot of business. So the president presented his contingency plan, but it doesn't contemplate the support of employers. So if you can comment on that, and how important is to support employers in this moment. And also there are a lot of fears in Mexico because people are not going to die of COVID-19, but they fear that they will die from starvation. So it's a very delicate situation, and not even, the pandemic has not even hit there. So if you can comment on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's go now to Juan Guillen from Zin. Yes, we will go now to Juan Guillen from Zin. Hello, can you hear me? Zin News? You have the floor, please. Hello? Yes, Zin News, please. Over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Ryder. I have three questions. So the Congressional Budget Office, I'm from Vietnam, by the way. So the Congressional Budget Office in the US, they predicted that the unemployment rate will still be around 9% at the end of 2021. So does it mean that the unemployment rate seems to be quite difficult to come down once it's gone up like that? And what are your comments on that? I know you would refrain from making predictions for beyond Q2 of 2020, but can you maybe comment further on how the unemployment crisis would get better from there if we have good signs on the pandemic? My second question is, to the extent that you can comment on individual countries, what are your assessments of Vietnam's proposed packages to support the people and businesses? And thirdly, your report mentioned repeatedly the relief measures needed for the enterprises and workers in the informal economy. And you mentioned that it's important to get the fund where the fund is needed. So how should the fund best be given to the informal economy? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more. Mr. Herbermann from Der Tagesspiegel, please. Over to you.
Principal question for you, Mr. Ryder, and it's on labor and workers' rights worldwide. Do you fear that this pandemic might lead to a rollback of labor and workers' rights throughout the world? Thanks.
Okay, let me then try to answer the questions. Let me start with the issues around the situation in Mexico. Let me benefit from that question to make some points which I hope will be relevant to Mexico, but more widely relevant as well. Now, Mexico is a country, you'll correct me if I've got my figures wrong, where informality is around the 50% mark or a bit more. Yeah. So Mexico is a classic case of a country with a very large number of people working in formality. By the way, the global average is 61%. It's the majority of the world's workers. And it's precisely these countries which are, I think, beginning to feel the effects of the pandemic. Now, the problem with all of this, of course, is that these are people who, in general, not exclusively, not always, but these are people who generally do not have access to the normal social protections that might go with a formal employment status. And the question is, how do you get, and I think it also is relevant to the question put by the last colleague who intervened, the question is, how do you help these people? And you've put in the most stark terms the danger of inaction or of ineffective action, because, you know, and I'm minded of what is happening in India right now as well. You know, if you require people to stop work and go home and stay at home, but they have absolutely no other source of income, then, as you've rather starkly said, the choice can become between that of protecting yourself against the virus but having no means of surviving, no way to feed yourself. And these are impossible dilemmas that people simply cannot be put into, because the point here is that all of the health disciplines, all of the confinement, the isolation disciplines cannot and will not be respected if people are confronted with that type of situation. And that leads me to what I want to say about what I think needs to be done in these circumstances. We need to find, and here I think international support is of fundamental importance. It's not even an option, it's a necessity. We need to find ways, and I don't think existing arrangements will do, to get the necessary means of support directly to the people who most need it. And this is extremely challenging as a policy objective. Social protection floors, guaranteed income, direct transfers of the basics of life have to get to those people whose option otherwise is simply that impossible choice of which I have spoken. You've mentioned that enterprises are not in receipt of support in Mexico. I'm not perhaps familiar with the specifics of that circumstance, but it seems to me that enterprises which are otherwise viable do need to receive state support in order to be able to get through the pandemic and to provide the livelihoods in normal circumstances that they previously have done. But it is important to attach to that support to enterprises the necessary conditions so that the people who work for those enterprises are also protected and benefit from the public support on offer. The exit from this crisis in terms of employment is something which is quite difficult to speculate upon. It's precisely why the ILO is not offering projections of where we think unemployment will end up at the end of this year. But I think experience does show that recovery from deep crisis, from recession goes quickest where enterprises and economies have managed to keep people connected to their normal employer, connected to their normal work activities. That was the experience in 2008, 2009. I take the example of Germany, where people who were kept on short-time work were furloughed, I guess, in current usage, and were able to resume their working life without having to be re-recruited. Enterprises didn't have to start from zero all over again. Well, this goes much, much quicker in those circumstances. So what we do now in terms of maintaining that relationship between workers and their enterprises, keep them on the labor market, that will pay dividends when it comes to the trajectory and the gradient of recovery, hopefully in the latter part of this year when we can start to look forward to getting out of this crisis. What about the packages that have been implemented so far? How good, how bad are they? Well, you know, the fact of the matter is we've done extraordinary things. Measures have been taken, arrangements have been reached, which I think deserve credit. There have been some extraordinary efforts made and they are continuing. But it would be foolish and I think unwise to suggest that enough has been done, that this is a once and for all measure that has to be taken and we can just wait for things to get better. These efforts have to be continued. If more resources have to be invested, then people need to take seriously that famous slogan of doing whatever it takes. If it takes a bit more, then clearly we need to do a bit more. What about worker rights? Is there a danger in these circumstances of a rollback? I don't think so. The danger can exist, but I don't see why it should happen. One encouraging thing that I've seen is that social dialogue, and this frequently happens, cooperation between governments and employers and workers has actually intensified in a number of countries, including countries where, as I've said, it's not the usual way of doing things. In conditions of crisis, people pull together. That notion that we're in it together actually has some type of consequence, but that has to be maintained. That really does have to be maintained. and it should not be eroded, and this is perhaps the thought behind the questioner's intent. We are seeing restrictions on our personal liberty in all sorts of ways. We're not allowed to go out in the ways that we normally do. We're not allowed to congregate in the ways that we normally do. And I think there is a degree of public acceptance that these restrictions on individual liberties are justified by the circumstances we're all going through. But that same logic does not apply, not at all, when it comes to those fundamental rights in the world of work. This is an entirely different set of rights. It's an entirely different set of circumstances. So I don't think there is any rationale whatsoever for using this pandemic as a pretext for restricting the workers' rights, the rights at work for which the ILO exists to defend.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to Ana Portela from Bloomberg, let me ask a question that came in from Kamal Shankar in India, and that's because he doesn't have a microphone. So the question, DG, is what is the projection of unemployment in India under this crisis out of 195 million across the globe? So that's a question of,
I have to reply that I don't have that figure. I'll turn to my colleague Sang-Yeon Lee, who is the main author of the report, who may be able to throw some light on that. And I think he also wanted to reply to something else, or maybe correct something I said.
Thank you, probably let me begin with some general observation about the statistics, so probably to put the bit of context for all the numbers. One thing I have to mention is that this is quite an unprecedented crisis in many respects. The first one is normally, as you know, the unemployment is normally response with some time gap to the crisis. So that's why if you have some serious economic crisis, then typically like 4 weeks or a couple of months, you really see big impact on employment. But this time it's different. As soon as you have a crisis in your country, you immediately see the employment impact. That's why we start to see the huge numbers on the job loss claim in the US and Canada, in most of the European countries. So that's why why this is so urgent situation, why we need the urgent large-scale policy measures, is because employment is responds very quickly and sensitively in a large scale to the crisis. This actually brings to another issue or concern that the crisis seems to take a little more time than expected to control. And then as I said, the employment is quickly response to that. We start to see the huge reduction in working hours, which means we have quite a relatively extended period of the working hour losses and unemployment. Then it means we have a serious challenge with the incomes and consumption. And also if the workers are unemployed or having shorter hours, that may mean their productive capacity will suffer in the end. So which means all these elements together, we expect, unless we have very serious and immediate actions taken right now, the recovery is going to be rather long and painful. So as you know, many actually economists are already talking about the risk of the L-shaped recovery, and rather than the V-shaped recovery, as we have seen the previous endemics. I think we are very sympathetic with that concern, because if we look at the job market and employment figures, I mean, there is certainly a cause of concern. And in terms of the specific estimate, because we are introducing quite of the smart and innovative way of the estimating the magnitude of the current employment challenges. So we are continuing to work on it, as we actually noted in the note. At the moment, for all the statistical complexity, we are not able to actually produce country level estimate with confidence at the moment. We are working on it, but at the moment, we actually are able to manage to produce the estimate at the sub-regional level. For example, there was a question about the Latin America. So actually we put together numbers for America, and then we put in 24 millions, the full-time equivalent. That includes both Canada and the US, and also the Mexico and Brazil, Argentina, and many other Latin American countries. In our estimate, already between 13 and 14 million workers will actually see the losses, losing their employment in terms of working hours in the next quarter in the Latin American countries. And the point here I want to make is that this is much larger than we expect and much more sensitive response than we expect. So we will hope that we will be able to share with you the country level estimate for at least for the large countries like Brazil and Mexico in our next update. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Ana Portela from Bloomberg, and then Agnes Pedrero from AFP. Ana Portela, over to you, please.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for letting me asking some questions. Following my colleague from Mexico as well, I would like to go a bit deeper into the kind of support that Mexican government should provide to especially the most vulnerable employers, which are the informal ones. But I would like you, please, Mr. Ryder, to be a bit more specific. What kind of subsidizes or funds should the government give to these people? Should them only be targeted to specific groups, the most vulnerable ones, or should we talk about a universal basic income? Please, if you can be more specific. Also, if you can specify us what kind of international measures would you like to see? What kind of international coordination you think would be the most appropriate today? And finally, considering you are the International Work Organization, what are the lessons taken from this crisis, considering that, as you have mentioned, 6 out of 10 employers are in informality, so in very precarious conditions? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Over to Agnes Pedrero from AFP, please.
Yes, hello, good morning, everybody. It's a question about the regions who are going to be affected. At the beginning, Mr. Ryder, you say that Arab states and Europe will be the region who will be the most affected in terms of percentage. So I have 2 questions. First question is, do you mean that this is the analysis for today, but that could change in 2 weeks, maybe? And the second question is if you could give us more insights about why these 2 specific regions will be mainly affected, specifically on Arab states. Thank you.
Okay, let me try to respond to those 2 questions. The first question goes back, well, to the specific case of Mexico, but to the more general idea of, well, what exactly are we talking about when we advocate support to enterprises? What should that look like? Well, the first thing to say, I think, is it does need to be targeted to those most in need, both in terms of enterprises and in terms of workers. Now, when it comes to enterprises, we know very well, don't we, that small and medium-sized enterprises do not have the treasury, the internal resources to survive very long when their normal income is cut off. And this is the situation of very large numbers of small enterprises. So we need to get money to them to keep them going. These viable organizations, which would otherwise be subjected to mortality, as it were. And that seems to me to be a key point. There are different ways, of course, of providing support to enterprises. You can give them tax holidays, you can suspend their social contributions, you can give them direct wage support. There's a whole load of things you could do. And frankly, those have to be tailored according to specific need. And I don't think it would help for me. I don't think I'm in a position to generalize around it. But what is important, and of course there'll be some much bigger examples of large companies who will also be applying to government for bailouts. One thinks of the airline industry, where we know already that there are some very difficult situations emerging. Sure, I don't believe that support to enterprises has to be exclusively limited to small enterprises, but it is important where those larger enterprises in particular gain access to public support, that support is carefully tailored to make sure that it does promote the wider social goals of retaining employment, keeping people in the employment relationship with the company. So this is a two-way street. You know, there's no such thing as a free lunch in these circumstances. And I think the design of enterprise support is particularly important. I hesitate, I fully understand why the phrase is being used, but I hesitate to apply it to the prevailing circumstances. But universal basic income, I think, has connotations and a meaning in normal times. These are not normal times, which are quite distinct from the situation that we're trying to address today. Yes, we do need to get direct cash resource transfers to people who are in desperate need. Yeah, and that looks a lot like universal basic income. But in fact, it is a temporary crisis response to an exceptional situation, to which I would not apply the term universal basic income. There's a whole different discussion around that, and it can be had at a different time. But we do, and I suppose the idea is similar, we do need to get the basic means of survival to people who desperately need it. You've asked me what type of international measures I would have in mind. Well, we've seen some things already done. I said earlier on that I don't think enough is being done, and I stand by that. But we have seen, for example, the bank and the fund, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, coming together in a joint appeal for debt relief. And these seem to me to be the minimum minimorum of the things that need to be done. But it's not enough. It's clearly not enough. We need to see very large scale resources made available to help those countries which are most vulnerable, least able to protect their people and provide the support that they need. And that has to be done systematically by the international community through reliable channels. And here the United Nations is the obvious candidate. The Secretary General of the United Nations has already set out a clear agenda to tackle the social and economic consequences of the pandemic. Very clear. It corresponds very closely with the issues we've been discussing today. He has established a UN response fund for this purpose. And today I will be taking part in a number of video meetings which will be giving precise substance to the type of services and support that the international community through the UN should be providing to countries who need this type of support. The regional breakdown, which we've talked about, let's be clear, those percentages that I've mentioned with Europe and the Arab states in Europe at the top end and Africa at the bottom end, these are the projections we make for the next 3 months. These are the projections which are part of that 195 million lost jobs for the next 3 months. Further along the time scale, the situation could look very different. And I think it depends on two things. The first thing is what the future trajectory of the pandemic is, where it hits. Obviously, where the pandemic hits region by region will bear a very strong relationship to what the employment impact will be. And that's not the easiest thing to predict for at least for the International Labour Organization. But at the same time, we know that the high-risk sectors, those sectors I mentioned earlier on as being particularly affected in terms of employment, we know that they are differentially distributed between the regions. And the statistics in our report show that the region where those high-risk sectors are most concentrated and present are in the first instance the Americas, followed by Europe and Central Asia. So if those continued to be the sectors that were highest at risk, you might expect those regions to receive a more than proportional impact in their employment situations.
Okay, before going back to more questions, let me give the floor to Sangjun, who wanted to add something, please.
Thank you. I just forgot to mention the response to the questions on India. This actually raises a bit of the broader issues right now. Now this COVID-19 is spreading very quickly to developing countries. When we are looking back, when actually we have the financial crisis, in the 2008 and 9, for example, normally the increases in unemployment was not very high in developing countries because the workers in those parts of the world, they cannot afford being unemployed. So they go out and then do something, whatever they can do for survival, which is typically informal employment. But this time it's different because of the lockdown arrangement in place in India, for example, in many parts of the world, even the informal workers, they cannot go out for doing some small business. So which means many of these informal workers will be pretty much out of work without any means of living. That's why actually the importance of providing income support, as our Director General mentioned, is critical at the moment. I think that is a very important area in which the government should take action very quickly. And as the Director General mentions, our estimate continues to be updated. The estimate we actually provided in the note is as of the 1st April. So we continue to update this virtually every day. So we actually provide the most updated estimate again in 2 weeks of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sangjun. Let's go to Hugo Neutel from TSF Radio in Portugal. Over to you, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Go ahead, please.
Hi, Mr. Ryder. I have my question centered on the European Union because Europe is being hit hard, particularly in Italy, Spain, and France, and these countries are a fundamental part of the European economy. So I have 3 questions. How do you classify EU's answer to the pandemic? Second question, once the health issue is dealt with, is it possible to have a quick job recovery, or are we in for the long term? And finally, do you think less rich countries like Portugal will be hit harder? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Antara News Agency, please.
Hello, good evening from Jakarta, Mr. Ryder. I'm Arya from Antara News Agency. My question is just, I think you said that the Asian region is predicted to see quite big losses from this pandemic. And I'm wondering if you have a projection on Indonesia specifically, or perhaps the Southeast Asian region within the ASEAN countries. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on how the community can sort of come together and help those who are most affected, who are most vulnerable, both from the formal and informal sectors. Thank you.
And let's stay with Asia. One more from Xinhua News Agency. Over to you, please. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Xinhua News Agency, if you can speak, please. Closer to the microphone, if you can, please. No, I'm sorry. It's very, very, very low. Okay, let's go to Nikkei, and then we'll try to come back to Xinhua News Agency. Nikkei, over to you, please. Nikkei, can you hear me?
Wait, yes, I can. Can you hear me? Yeah, I've got just a simple question related with figures. The new global estimates indicate that working hours will decline by 6.7%. Although, can you, maybe you've said it before, I don't know, is compared to when and to what?
There we go. Okay, let's start then with the question from Portugal, I think it was, on the European Union. Well, how would I, describe the EU response so far? But I think it's a classic case where we've seen a series of sometimes commendable national responses. But I think we have seen, and I think most European leaders would agree with this, considerable difficulty in constructing a unified European response to the pandemic. It's not the first time that Europe struggled to find common positions around important challenges in recent years. Now, I won't go into the whole controversy around Corona bonds and some of the polemics that have involved not least the Prime Minister of Portugal. But what I think is being tested is the capacity of the European Union to act with a spirit of solidarity and mutual support. I think this is quite clear, and I think that it is absolutely essential for those of us who believe in Europe, and as a Brit, I believe very strongly in Europe. I think it is absolutely essential that Europe come together and find common purpose and common policies to formulate a truly European response. And I will link that comment to the last of the questions that came from the first speaker. Will the less rich countries suffer most? Well, two sides to that really. One is, where will the pandemic hit most? And we're seeing what's been happening in Italy and in Spain and to a degree France. The pandemic will not necessarily discriminate in terms of where it hits, except to say the capacities of countries to react to it and to limit the damage that it does, both in health and economic terms, is strongly linked to the strength of health systems and health provision. So to that extent, there is concern that the poorer countries would be the more vulnerable. And you've come back to this question of what the recovery from this crisis might look like. Sang-Yeon, my colleague, has already spoken to the dangers of an L-shaped rather than a V-shaped recovery. I think it is very difficult for me to say more than what Sang-Yeon has said about that, except that we have every interest in ensuring that the recovery, A, begins sooner rather than later, and that depends very much on the success of health measures, and then that it is a recovery which goes on a steep upward gradient. And I repeat what I've said. I think that depends at least to a significant extent on the nature of the measures being taken now to keep people's connectivity with the world of work. The second question, if I understood it correctly, it was a little difficult to hear the question, I think was around the situation in Southeast Asia, and then something about community responses. Well, you probably had a chance to look at our figures in respect of the Asian Pacific region. We have seen some very positive stories coming out of Asia in terms of the capacity to bring an end or to start to see rapid reduction in the extent of the pandemic. I think we speak on the day that Wuhan is basically reopening for business, and it's a very encouraging sign and something to be learnt from. We also know that the region does also, of course, run the risk of the second wave coming in, and we're seeing that in Japan, for example. This is an acute worry today. My view on that, again, abstracting from what the pandemic might do in the region, is to look at the conditions on the labor markets of Southeast Asia. And there you have a variety of conditions which can combine in some ways to help us through this. Very dynamic economies, differential levels of informality, but some strong health provision situations as well. So it's, again, difficult to be too formal in terms of predictions. It's clear, as our figures show, that the vast majority of those 195 million lost full-time job equivalents, they are in the Asia-Pacific region. This is where it's been hurting. And I think what happens in countries like India, what happens in Pakistan and elsewhere, are going to be extraordinarily important, and they're difficult to predict at this point. I think community responses has been one of the most interesting sociological phenomena of the pandemic response. And we are seeing, it's a cliche, isn't it, that the pandemic brings out the best and the worst in people. There's been a lot of the best coming out of community reactions. You know, not just support for those frontline workers, those 170 million people around the world who are in the front line in health and social services, who are at the same time doing extraordinary work to bring an end to this pandemic and protect those who have been afflicted by it. And at the same time, keeping the world of work moving. I mean, this is an extraordinary thing. And I think we've seen the extent to which communities are coming together to support them, but also to support people who find themselves isolated, elderly people, isolated and in need. So I do think that the community, you know, going beyond the anecdotal to the systemic, I do think community responses are really very, very important. I think there's a lot to be encouraged by from what we're seeing around the world. Going back to the figures, I think the last question was really about, well, you talk about a 6.7 percentage reduction in hours worked. This is compared to, well, it's for the second quarter of the year, so it's compared, the baseline is what was there before the first quarter. And there, before the second quarter, I said already that at the beginning of the year, the outlook was for 190 million unemployed. That was our pre-pandemic forecast for the year. We've also tried to construct some sort of figures on what happened in the first 3 months of the year, and our data is incomplete. Sang-Yeon can elaborate on this if you need further details. But from the information available to us, and there's more information available for the industrialized world, we would estimate that in the first trimester of the year, you know, something between 30 and 40 million jobs have already been lost. So that's what we're measuring from. This is a continuing story. It's not the start of the story. And I think that's as well as I can answer the question. Sang-Yeon, have I said it right? Do you want to add something?
That's right. Just adding a couple of points here that when we actually making first estimation, of course, this is a prediction. We made some important assumption. First, the possible size of the economic shock, and also how long the pandemic will last, and also how actually employment will respond to that. And on all these three points, our actually assumption turned out to be rather optimistic. And so that's why, rather than revising these numbers right away, we start to look at what is the immediate responses in employment in the coming 3 months. So that's why actually we estimate, we just report on the second quarter. And what's going to happen by the end of the year, it's very hard to know, for the reason actually Director General has described. As the Director General mentions, our plan is to assess what has happened in the first quarter, and then coming up with some tentative estimate of the magnitude of the job losses in the first quarter. We hope that we'll report it again in the next update.
Thank you. We're getting to the end of this press conference. However, let me read to you the question that came from Xinhua News Agency. It says, DG, you've mentioned in your introductory remarks that the biggest losses of working hours are in the Asian Pacific region. I wonder whether this conclusion has put into consideration China's changing field, that more and more employees are getting back to work and more factories are reopening their doors. How may those changes in China help to mitigate the gloomy picture?
Yeah, well, let me just again reiterate what our figures say in the report. They show that the estimated full-time job losses, equivalent losses in Asia and Pacific would be 125 million in the coming 3 months. Now, clearly, and I've made reference to it, there are some good signs coming out of China. Wuhan has gone back to work, as it were. And it is, I think, very clear that the rapidity of recovery in China will have an influence clearly going forward. on the number of job losses that are recorded. So I think the intent of the question very well. You know, this is not absolute science. A lot depends on the evolution of things which today are not knowable over the coming months towards the end of the year. And yeah, we have to treat these figures with that caveat in mind.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of this virtual press conference. A reminder that the embargo lifts at 4 o'clock Central European time. The audio of this interview will be sent to you in a few minutes, and the video recording will be made available on the ILO website as of 4 o'clock. If you have any follow-up questions, and many of you do, please get in touch with newsroom@ilo.org. That's newsroom@ilo.org. And we'll put you in touch with Sanjun Lee and his team for any follow-up questions you may have. Thank you very much for taking part. And like the DG and Sanjun said, we'll be back with an update in about 2 weeks' time. Thank you. Have a nice day, everyone. Bye-bye.